November 16th, 2019, 12:07 p.m. Dabolim Naval Air Station, Goa, India. A twin-seat MiG-29 KUB, serial number KUB-09, thunders down runway 26 at Dabolim. Its two Klimov RD-33MK engines, each pushing nearly 20,000 pounds of thrust. At the controls sits Commander Rajiv Mehra, one of the Indian Navy's most experienced carrier-qualified fighter pilots, a man with over 2,000 hours in fast jets and more than 100 arrested landings aboard the aircraft carrier INS Vikramaditya. In the rear seat, Lieutenant Arjun Nair, 28 years old, 3 months away from completing his carrier qualification. A young officer with everything ahead of him. The sky above Goa is cloudless. The Arabian Sea glitters to the west like a sheet of hammered copper. The temperature on the tarmac reads 34 degrees Celsius. Humidity sits at 78%. It is, by every measure, a routine training sortie, the kind of flight these two men have done dozens of times before. They are scheduled to practice intercept profiles, low-level navigation, and a series of touch-and-go landings. The flight plan calls for 90 minutes in the air. They will get less than 3, because in approximately 170 seconds after lifting off the runway, both engines on this $40 million warplane will be dead. Both of them. Simultaneously. And at that exact moment, Commander Rajiv Mehra will face a decision that no amount of training can fully prepare a human being for. A decision measured not in minutes, not even in seconds, but in fractions of a heartbeat, with the ground rushing up beneath him and nothing but silence, where 2 jet engines used to scream. But before we find out what happens in that cockpit, if you're the kind of person who finds these stories as gripping as I do, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means we can keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, let's go back. To understand what happened over Goa that afternoon, you first need to understand the machine at the center of this story, and the man who was flying it. The Mikoyan MiG-29 is one of the most recognizable fighter jets ever built. Conceived in the early 1970s by the Soviet Union's Mikoyan Design Bureau, it was born out of a very specific fear that the Americans were building fighters so advanced, so lethal, that nothing in the Soviet inventory could match them. The F-15 Eagle had entered service in 1976. The F-16 Fighting Falcon followed 2 years later. Together, they represented a generational leap in air combat capability, and Moscow knew it needed an answer. That answer came in 2 forms. The larger, heavier response was the Sukhoi Su-27, a long-range air superiority fighter designed to go toe-to-toe with the F-15. The smaller, lighter response, the one built for speed, agility, and sheer dogfighting ferocity, was the MiG-29. NATO gave it the reporting name Fulcrum, and Soviet pilots liked the name so much they started using it themselves. The Fulcrum first flew on October 6, 1977. American spy satellites spotted it within weeks. By 1983, it was in frontline service. The MiG-29 is powered by 2 Klimov RD-33 afterburning turbofan engines, each producing roughly 18,300 pounds of thrust with afterburner engaged. The engines sit in 2 widely spaced nacelles beneath the fuselage, a configuration that actually generates additional lift, reducing effective wing loading and giving the Fulcrum its legendary agility. The aircraft can sustain 9 G-turns. It can fly at angles of attack that would stall most Western fighters. It is in the hands of a skilled pilot, an extraordinarily dangerous opponent, but the RD-33 has always had a reputation, not a good one. From the very beginning of the engine's operational life, pilots and maintenance crews reported issues. Oil system leaks that released toxic fumes into the cockpit ventilation, compressor blades that eroded faster than predicted, heavy, distinctive black smoke trailing from the exhaust, a telltale signature caused by the engine's relatively short combustion chamber that made the MiG-29 visible from miles away. And most critically, a susceptibility to foreign object damage that was, in many ways, built into the aircraft's very design. The MiG-29 was designed to operate from rough, unprepared airfields, so its main engine intakes could be closed during ground operations, with auxiliary inlets on top of the fuselage providing air instead. The naval variant, the MiG-29K, replaced those intake doors with retractable grills, a different solution to the same problem. The Indian Navy, which began receiving MiG-29K and MiG-29KUB aircraft in 2009 as part of a deal worth over $2 billion, discovered the limitations of both solutions the hard way. India's national auditor, the Comptroller and Auditor General, published a devastating report in 2016. Out of 65 RD-33MK engines procured from Russia, 40, representing 62% of the entire fleet, had to be withdrawn from service due to design-related defects or deficiencies. The aircraft's full authority, digital electronic control system known as FADEC, which governs every aspect of engine performance, suffered chronic failures. There had been 10 documented cases of pilots being forced to land on a single engine after the other failed in flight. The overall serviceability rate of the MiG-29K fleet hovered between 16 and 38%, meaning that on any given day, fewer than 4 out of every 10 aircraft were actually capable of flying. But what exactly happens when a jet engine fails? To understand the nightmare that was about to unfold in Commander Mera's cockpit, you need to understand the mechanics of it. A jet engine is, at its most basic, a controlled explosion. Air enters through the intake, gets compressed by a series of spinning fan blades, the compressor, and is then mixed with fuel in the combustion chamber. The mixture ignites. The resulting blast of hot gas exits through the turbine at tremendous speed, spinning the turbine blades as it goes, which in turn drives the compressor at the front. It is a self-sustaining cycle, as long as everything stays in balance. A compressor stall occurs when that balance breaks. The airflow through the compressor gets disrupted by a sudden change in angle of attack, by turbulent air entering the intake, by foreign objects striking the blades, or by a dozen other factors. When the blades stall, the smooth flow of air through the engine reverses. You get a violent explosive backfire, a bang that can shake the entire airframe. The engine temperature spikes. Thrust drops to nearly zero. If the stall is severe enough, or if it happens in both engines at once, the pilot is suddenly sitting in a 40,000-pound glider. And a MiG-29 is not a good glider, not even close. Without engine power, the fulcrum has a glide ratio of roughly 6-to-1, meaning that for every 1,000 feet of altitude, the aircraft can travel about 6,000 feet horizontally. Compare that to a commercial airliner, like a Boeing 737, which can glide at roughly 17-to-1, or a sailplane, which can achieve ratios of 40-to-1 or more. The MiG-29, designed for raw performance rather than aerodynamic efficiency, drops like a particularly well-shaped brick. Now, let's talk about the man in the front seat. Commander Rajiv Mehra grew up in Jamnagar, Gujarat, a city that happens to be home to one of the Indian Air Force's major fighter bases. As a boy, he watched MiG-21s and MiG-27s streak across the sky every day on their way to the practice range over the Rann of Kutch. By the time he was 12, he knew, with the absolute and unshakable certainty that only a child can possess, that he would fly fighters. He joined the Indian Navy as a short service commission officer in 2003 and earned his wings at INS Rajali. His early career was spent flying the aging Sea Harrier, a vertical takeoff and landing jet that the Indian Navy operated from its older carrier, INS Virat. The Sea Harrier was a demanding aircraft, unforgiving of mistakes, brutal in its handling characteristics, and powered by a single Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine that was both mechanically complex and chronically thirsty. Flying it taught Mehra something that would prove invaluable later: how to stay calm when everything is falling apart. When the Indian Navy transitioned to the MiG-29K, Mehra was among the first cohorts selected for conversion training. He traveled to Russia, to the Nitka Naval Aviation Training Facility in Crimea, where he practiced arrested landings on a shore-based ski jump. He completed carrier qualifications aboard INS Vikramaditya in 2014 and quickly established himself as one of the squadron's most capable pilots. By 2019, at 38 years old, he was a senior instructor with Indian Naval Air Squadron 303, the Black Panthers, and his primary mission had shifted from combat to teaching the next generation of carrier pilots. Which brings us to Lieutenant Arjun Nair, the young man in the back seat. Nair was everything you would want in a naval aviator: sharp, focused, physically fit, and possessed of that particular combination of confidence and humility that separates the good pilots from the great ones. He had graduated near the top of his class at the Naval Academy in Ezhamala, Kerala, and had been handpicked for fighter aviation. By November 2019, he had logged approximately 300 hours in the MiG-29 KUB and was within weeks of his final carrier qualification exercise. That morning, Nair had arrived at the squadron ready room at 0730, gone through the standard meteorological briefing, reviewed the flight plan, and spent 30 minutes in the cockpit procedures trainer running through emergency scenarios. One of those scenarios, as it happened, was dual engine failure. In the simulator, he had performed adequately, following the checklist, making the correct calls, arriving at the decision point with enough altitude to either attempt a restart or eject. It had been clinical, procedural, calm. The real thing would be nothing like that. At 11:58 hours, Mehra and Nair walked out to the flight line where Cub 09 sat on the tarmac, its twin tails catching the midday sun. The crew chief, Petty Officer Suresh Kumar, a 20-year veteran who had serviced more MiG-29s than he could count, met them at the aircraft with the maintenance log. Everything was green. Both engines had been inspected that morning. Oil levels were nominal. The FADEC system had passed its self-diagnostic test. The hydraulic systems were fully charged. The Zvezda K-36DM ejection seats, widely considered among the best in the world, capable of saving a pilot at speeds from 0 to 760 knots and altitudes from 0 to 82,000 feet, had been inspected, armed, and certified. Mehra strapped in, ran through his pre-flight checks with the precision of a man who had done this over 1,000 times, and at 12:03 hours, received clearance to taxi. 4 minutes later, with the engines wound up to military power, full dry thrust without afterburner, Cub 09 rolled down runway 26 and lifted into the Goan sky. The takeoff was textbook. The Fulcrum climbed steeply over the coast, the green-brown patchwork of palm groves and laterite quarries falling away beneath them. Mesra brought the aircraft around to a heading of 270, pointing them out over the Arabian Sea. He leveled off at 5,000 feet and began accelerating to the mission's first waypoint. In the back seat, Nair was running through his radar checks, configuring the aircraft's systems for the intercept exercise they were about to begin. At 12:07 hours, 4 minutes into the flight, Mera pushed the throttles forward to begin the climb to their working altitude of 15,000 feet. The twin RD-33 MKs responded instantly, each engine developing roughly 19,000 pounds of thrust as the afterburners lit. The Fulcrum surged upward, pressing both men back into their seats with 3 Gs of acceleration. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 6,000 feet, 7,000, 8. And then something happened that should not have happened. Mera heard it before he felt it. A sound like a shotgun blast, sharp and concussive, coming from somewhere beneath and behind him. In the same instant, the aircraft shuddered violently, a deep structural tremor that ran through the airframe like a shockwave through water. The master caution light snapped on. The left engine fire warning illuminated, a blood-red light in the center of the annunciator panel that no pilot ever wants to see. His training kicked in before conscious thought could form. Left hand to the throttle, pull the left engine to cut off. Fuel shut off, confirmed. Fire extinguisher armed. His eyes swept the instrument panel in a scan pattern so deeply practiced it was involuntary. Right engine RPM, right engine EGT, right engine fuel flow, hydraulic pressures, electrical bus status. Everything on the right side was normal. For exactly 1.7 seconds, everything on the right side was normal. Then it wasn't. The right engine instruments, which had been showing textbook parameters, went haywire in a cascade of warnings that lit up the annunciator panel like a Christmas tree in hell. RPM dropped from 87% to 40% in the space of a single heartbeat. The exhaust gas temperature spiked past 900 degrees, well beyond the red line. The engine surge warning activated. And then, with a sickening mechanical finality that Mera would later describe as the sound of something dying, the right engine RPM wound down through 20%, 15, 10, and stopped. In the back seat, Nair's voice came through the intercom, tight and controlled, but with an edge of disbelief that he couldn't quite hide. "Sir, we've lost the right engine. Instruments showing 0 thrust. Left engine fire warning is still active," Mera already knew. He was staring at the most terrifying instrument panel a fighter pilot can see. 2 engine fire warning lights, one illuminated, the other dark, but with every gauge reading 0. The left engine was on fire. The right engine was dead. At approximately 8,400 feet, climbing through scattered thermals over the coastal waters of western India, his $40 million warplane had just become a 20-ton paperweight. And now there was the silence. Fighter pilots spend their entire careers surrounded by noise. The constant reassuring thunder of jet engines, the hiss of the environmental control system, the chatter of radio calls, the subtle vibration of thousands of moving parts working in harmony. When the engines die, all of that vanishes. What remains is a silence so profound, so alien, that the human brain struggles to process it. You can hear your own breathing inside the oxygen mask. You can hear the creak of the canopy as the airframe flexes under aerodynamic loads it was never designed to carry alone. You can hear the wind, not the controlled rush of powered flight, but the eerie, whistling moan of a machine falling through the air with nothing to hold it up but momentum and physics. It is the loneliest sound in the world. Mehra had exactly one advantage in this moment, and he knew it: altitude. He had 8,400 feet of altitude, and at the MiG-29's unpowered descent rate of approximately 4,000 feet per minute, that gave him roughly 2 minutes before he would run out of sky. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. That was his entire margin. The difference between life and death, measured in the time it takes to brush your teeth. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was whether those 2 minutes would be enough. The emergency procedure for dual engine failure in the MiG-29 is a document of brutal simplicity. It fits on a single page of the aircraft's flight manual, written in the clipped, emotionless language that military technical writers use for situations that are anything but emotionless. The checklist contains exactly 7 steps. And the first step, the most critical step, the one that everything else depends on, is this: establish the aircraft in the optimal glide configuration. For the MiG-29, that means a speed of approximately 350 kilometers per hour with the wings clean, no flaps, no slats, no speed brakes. At this speed, the aircraft achieves its best lift-to-drag ratio, maximizing the distance it can travel for every foot of altitude it surrenders. Get the speed wrong. Too fast and you burn through altitude like money through a gambler's hands. Too slow and you risk a departure from controlled flight, a stall that at this altitude would leave no time for recovery, and nothing else on the checklist matters. Mehra's hands moved before his conscious mind fully caught up with what was happening. 15 years of training, of simulator sessions, of emergency procedures drilled into muscle memory until they became as automatic as breathing. All of it kicked in simultaneously. He pulled the throttles to idle, a reflexive action that, in the case of a dead engine, does nothing. But the training was too deeply ingrained to skip. He pushed the nose over, trading the last of the climb for airspeed, and felt the aircraft settle into a descending glide. The airspeed indicator stabilized at 360 kilometers per hour. Close enough. Step 2, attempt an engine restart. The RD-33 engine has an air start capability, meaning it can be relit in flight if the turbine is still windmilling, the fuel system is functioning, and the compressor has not been catastrophically damaged. The procedure involves selecting the engine start switch, confirming fuel flow, and waiting for ignition. Under ideal conditions, at the right altitude, the right speed, with a clean engine that has simply flamed out due to fuel interruption, a restart can be accomplished in 15 to 20 seconds, but there was nothing ideal about this situation. Mera keyed the intercom. Arjun, I'm going to attempt a restart on the right engine first. Left engine is showing fire. I'm not touching it. Monitor the instruments and call out any changes. Copy, sir. Right engine windmill RPM is at 12%. EGT is dropping. Fuel pressure shows normal on the right side. 12% windmill. That was borderline. The minimum RPM for a successful air start on the RD-33 was generally considered to be around 15%, though Mera had heard stories, the kind of stories that circulate in fighter squadrons like folktales around a campfire, about Russian test pilots who claimed to have relit engines at even lower speeds. The question was whether the right engine had flamed out cleanly, a simple combustion interruption that could be corrected, or whether it had suffered the same catastrophic mechanical failure that had clearly destroyed the left engine. There was only one way to find out. He reached for the right engine start switch and flipped it. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The cockpit was silent except for the whistle of the wind and the steady, metronomic clicking of the master caution warning. Mehra watched the right engine RPM gauge with the intensity of a man staring at the last card in a poker hand worth his life. 11%, 10.5, 10. The windmill was decaying. The engine was not restarting. It was dying. No joy on the right engine, Nair reported from the back seat, his voice now carrying a quality that Mera recognized, the sound of a man who has just realized with perfect clarity that the situation is not going to get better. RPM continuing to decrease. 8% and falling, Mera tried again. Second attempt. The start switch cycled. He watched the fuel flow indicator twitch. The fuel was reaching the combustion chamber, but there was no ignition. The compressor, damaged by whatever had killed the engine in the first place, was not generating enough airflow to support combustion. The right engine was gone. He made his decision in less than a second. Both engines were finished. The left was on fire. The right was destroyed from within. He was now in a dead-stick MiG-29 at approximately 7,200 feet, descending at roughly 4,000 feet per minute over a heavily populated coastal area in southwestern India. He had maybe 90 seconds of controlled flight remaining. He keyed the radio. Dabalim Tower, this is Panther 09, declaring emergency. Dual engine failure. Current altitude 7,200 feet. Position approximately 8 nautical miles west of the field, requesting immediate vectors for emergency approach. The tower controller's response was instantaneous. The voice of a professional who understood with cold clarity that the next few words out of his mouth might be the last thing these two pilots ever heard from the ground. Panther 09, Dabalim Tower, copies your emergency. Runway 26 is clear. Winds are 240 at 12 knots. You're cleared for immediate approach, all altitudes. Emergency services are being scrambled. State your intentions. State your intentions. 4 words that contain the fundamental question of the moment, the question that would determine whether Commander Rajiv Mehra and Lieutenant Arjun Nair lived or died, and whether the people below them lived or died too. What are you going to do? Are you going to bring this aircraft home? Or are you going to eject? This is the decision that defines a pilot, not the takeoffs, not the landings, not the combat missions or the medal ceremonies. This, the moment when everything goes wrong and you have to choose. Let's be clear about what ejection means in this context. The K-36DM ejection seat aboard the MiG-29 KUB is one of the most capable escape systems ever built. It can save a pilot at 0 altitude and 0 airspeed. It has been tested at speeds up to Mach 2.5 and altitudes up to 56,000 feet. At the 1989 Paris Air Show, it saved test pilot Anatoly Kovochur when he ejected just 2 seconds before his MiG-29 hit the ground at 92 meters altitude. The K-36DM works, but ejection is not gentle. The catapult fires at 14 to 20 Gs, enough to fracture vertebrae. The wind blast at 350 kilometers per hour hits like a wall. Limbs can break, shoulders can dislocate, and then comes the parachute shock in the landing, which over water brings drowning, entanglement, and hypothermia into the equation. Ejection is survivable. Ejection is absolutely, categorically not fun, but the alternative, trying to dead stick a MiG-29 back to the runway, is something for which no published procedure exists. The MiG-29 was never designed for unpowered landing. Its glide ratio of 6 to 1 makes it almost a theoretical impossibility. Commander Mera did the calculation in his head. 8 miles to the runway. From 7,200 feet with a 6 to 1 ratio, he had roughly 7 miles of range. He was short by a mile, but Mera knew something that the math did not account for. He was not at 7,000 feet in level flight. He was at 7,000 feet in a descent, which meant he had forward momentum, kinetic energy that could be converted to distance. He also knew that the wind was coming from 240 at 12 knots, nearly straight down the runway, giving him a component of tailwind that would push him toward the field. And he knew one more thing, something that came not from training manuals or simulator sessions, but from 15 years of flying over this exact stretch of coastline. He knew what was below him. Between his current position and Dabolim Naval Air Station, the terrain was a patchwork of fishing villages, coconut plantations, tourist hotels, and, critically, the densely populated suburbs of Vasco da Gama, a city of over 100,000 people, the Kendria Vidyalaya School, the Central Market, the residential towers of Mangar Hill. If he ejected now, the unguided aircraft would continue on its current trajectory and impact somewhere in that urban sprawl. At 350 kilometers per hour, with several thousand pounds of JP-5 jet fuel still in its tanks, the resulting fireball would be devastating. The casualty count could be in the dozens, perhaps more. The ejection handle was right there between his legs, painted yellow and black, the universal colors of last resort. All he had to do was pull. The canopy would blow, the rockets would fire. He and Nair would be floating under parachutes in less than 3 seconds. Safe, alive, their duty to the aircraft legally and morally discharged. But below them, people were going about their Saturday. Fishermen were mending nets on the beach at Bogmalo. Children were playing cricket in the dusty yards behind their houses. Women were hanging laundry on the rooftops of apartment buildings. Auto rickshaws were threading through the narrow streets of Vasco, their horns bleeding in the midday heat. None of them knew that a crippled fighter jet was hurtling toward them at the speed of a racing car, and none of them would have time to move if it came down. Mera keyed the intercom. His voice, when he spoke, was flat. Not calm exactly, but controlled with a deliberateness that cost him more effort than anything he had ever done in a cockpit. Arjun, I'm going to try to make the field. We have the altitude if we manage it right, and I will not put this aircraft into a populated area. I need you to stay with me on the instruments. If I call eject, you go immediately. Do not hesitate. Do not wait for me. Do not ask questions. Pull the handle. Understood? There was a pause, maybe half a second, but in the accelerated time of an emergency, it felt like an eternity. Nair processed what his instructor was telling him. They were going to attempt something the book said couldn't be done, and the reason was the people on the ground below them. Understood, sir. I'm with you. Mera banked the aircraft gently to the right, pointing the nose toward the coastline. The maneuver cost him altitude. Every turn in a glider does, because the bank angle increases the effective wing loading and the induced drag that comes with it. But he needed to align himself with the runway. He rolled out on a heading of 090, pointing east, directly toward the airfield. The altimeter read 6,400 feet and unwinding. What followed was the longest 90 seconds of Commander Rajiv Mehra's life. He flew the aircraft with a precision that bordered on the surgical, making micro-adjustments to pitch and bank angle that would have been imperceptible to anyone watching from the ground, but that, in the cockpit, represented the difference between reaching the runway and falling short into the city below. Every knot of airspeed was monitored. Every 100 feet of altitude was accounted for. He flew the way a tightrope walker walks, with total concentration, absolute commitment, and the knowledge that even a momentary lapse could be fatal. The coastline passed beneath them. He could see the fishing boats at Bogmalo, their painted hulls bright against the dark water, red and blue and green, bobbing gently in the afternoon swell. He could see the Zuari River Bridge, a thread of concrete spanning the broad estuary. He could see the laterite cliffs of the headland glowing rust red in the midday sun, and ahead, still distant, still tantalizingly out of reach, he could see the dark rectangle of runway 26 at Dabolim, with the red and blue lights of emergency vehicles already clustering at its edges like fireflies gathering at dusk. 5,000 feet, Nair called out. 6 miles to the field. Mera did the math again. 5,000 feet at 6-to-1 glide ratio gave him 30,000 feet of range. About 5 nautical miles. He needed 6. He was still a mile short, but the wind was helping him. A persistent push from the southwest, adding roughly 20 feet per second to his ground track. And as the aircraft descended into denser air near the coast, its aerodynamic efficiency improved slightly. It was close. Agonizingly close, but it might be enough. Dabolim Tower, Panther 09. I'm attempting dead stick approach to runway 26. Current altitude 5,000 feet, range approximately 6 miles. Request you keep the runway clear and advise on any traffic. Panther 09, runway is clear, no traffic. Emergency vehicles are in position. Winds 240 at 12 knots, gusting 16. We have you on radar at 5,000 feet, 6 miles west. You are tracking directly for the field. Good luck, Commander. Good luck? 2 words that controllers never say. Controllers say cleared to land and say intentions. When a controller says good luck, it means he's out of procedures and is running on hope. At 4,000 feet, the city of Vasco da Gama slid beneath the aircraft. Mera could see individual cars on the road below, white Maruti Suzukis and black Ambassador sedans, threading through traffic that had no idea what was happening above them. He could see the blue rectangles of swimming pools and hotel courtyards. He could see the clock tower in the town center, its hands showing 12 minutes past noon. He could see people, tiny figures, going about their Saturday lives, shopping and eating and talking and laughing, utterly unaware that 40,000 pounds of aluminum, titanium, and jet fuel was passing silently over their heads, like a falling star in broad daylight. The silence was still the worst part. In a normal approach, the engines would be at idle, producing a reassuring background rumble, a sound so constant and so familiar that pilots don't even hear it anymore, the way you don't hear the hum of your refrigerator until it stops. Now there was nothing. Just the wind, just the creak of the airframe, just the sound of two men breathing inside their oxygen masks, each breath a small act of faith that there would be another one after it. At 3,200 feet, something changed. The left engine fire warning light, which had been glowing steadily since the initial failure, a constant accusatory red eye staring at Mara from the instrument panel, suddenly went out. Mara glanced at it, then at the engine instruments. Left engine temperature was dropping rapidly. The fire had burned itself out. Or more likely, the fuel feeding it had been exhausted as the last of the JP-5 and the damaged fuel lines was consumed. It was a small mercy, but it meant one thing. The aircraft was not going to explode in midair. Not today. 3,000 feet, Nair reported. 3.5 miles to the runway threshold. Airspeed 340. We're going to make it, sir. I think we're going to make it. Mara said nothing. He was beyond words now, operating in a state of focused concentration so intense that language itself had become irrelevant. His entire consciousness had narrowed to 3 instruments: the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, and the attitude indicator, the artificial horizon that told him whether his wings were level. Everything else, the fire, the fear, the future, had been pushed to the periphery of his awareness, compressed and contained like pressure in a sealed vessel. He would deal with it later, if there was a later. 2,500 feet. 2.5 miles to go. He was going to make it. The realization arrived not as a flood of relief, but as a new kind of fear. Because now, for the first time since the engines had died, Mara had something to lose. A minute ago, the outcome had seemed binary: eject or crash. Now there was a third possibility, a narrow corridor of survival that he was threading with the precision of a surgeon's needle through living tissue. And the thought of failing now, of coming so close, only to fall short at the last moment, was almost worse than the certainty of disaster had been. At 2,000 feet, he lowered the landing gear. This was perhaps the single most consequential decision of the entire emergency. Lowering the gear on a dead stick fighter creates enormous drag. Deploy too early and you bleed off irreplaceable energy. Deploy too late and you arrive at the runway too fast. Mehra deployed the gear at 2,000 feet and 2 miles from the threshold, a judgment call born from 15 years of experience. He heard the emergency hydraulic pump whine and felt the gear lock into position with 3 distinct thuds. 3 green, Nair confirmed, his voice cracking slightly for the first time. Gear is down and locked. All 3 green. The drag hit immediately. The airspeed, which had been holding steady at 340 kilometers per hour, began to decay. 320, 300, 280. The aircraft was slowing, settling, sinking toward the ground on a steepening glide path that was taking it directly, toward the displaced threshold of runway 26. At 1,000 feet, Mara could see the runway markings. The PAPI lights showed 4 red, below normal glide slope, but there was no normal glide slope today. Today, gravity and aerodynamics dictated the path, and Mara was following it with the commitment of a man who has cast his lot and will see it through. 500 feet. The runway filled his windscreen. He could see the 4 fire trucks positioned along the runway edge, their silver-suited crews watching the silent aircraft descend. 300 feet. He pulled back gently on the stick, just a fraction, just enough to raise the nose 2 degrees. Beginning the flare, the transition from descent to landing that in a powered aircraft is cushioned by a whisper of throttle, and that in an unpowered one is cushioned by nothing at all except the pilot's feel for the machine and the air and the ground rushing up to meet them. 200 feet. 100. 50. The runway threshold markers flashed beneath the nose. The aircraft was over concrete now, over the salvation of flat, unobstructed pavement that stretched 3,000 meters ahead of them. 20 feet. 10. The main landing gear touched the concrete at 12 and 11 hours. Exactly 4 minutes and 13 seconds after the engines had failed. The impact was harder than a normal landing, perhaps 2.5 Gs, where a normal carrier-style touchdown would be 1.5, because without engine power to fine-tune the approach speed, Mara had come in slightly fast and slightly steep, but the aircraft stayed on the center line. The nose gear came down a moment later with a sharp bark of rubber on concrete. The anti-skid braking system engaged automatically, and Mara pressed the brake pedals with measured, deliberate pressure. Too hard and the tires would blow, leaving him skidding sideways down the runway on bare rims. Too soft, and he would roll off the end. The emergency arresting hook, which Mara had deployed as a precaution, an instinct born from years of carrier operations, caught the deck pendant at the 1,500-foot mark, and the aircraft decelerated with a sharp, physical jolt that threw both men forward against their harnesses. The shoulder straps bit into Mara's collarbones. His helmet slammed forward against the headrest. The instrument panel blurred, And then stillness. KUB-09 came to a stop approximately 1,800 feet past the touchdown point. The fire trucks converged, their crews spraying foam around the aircraft as a precaution against fuel leakage. The canopy opened. The going air, 34 degrees, carrying the smell of the sea and jasmine from the perimeter fence, hit Mara like a warm embrace. It was the most beautiful air he had ever breathed. For a long moment, neither man moved. Mehera sat in the front seat, his helmet visor up, his oxygen mask hanging loose against his jaw, staring at the runway ahead with the expression of a man who has just traveled a very great distance in a very short time and is not entirely certain he has arrived. Behind him, Nair was gripping the cockpit rails with both hands, his knuckles white beneath his Nomex flight gloves, his chest rising and falling with breaths that were too rapid and too deep, and that would not, for several minutes, return to normal. Then Mara did something that would later become the detail everyone remembered, the moment that the ground crew would talk about for years, that Nair would describe in interviews, that would eventually find its way into the unofficial lore of Indian Naval Air Squadron 303. He reached up, very slowly, and placed his hand flat against the instrument panel, the glass and metal surface that had been his entire universe for the last 4 minutes and 13 seconds, and held it there. 5 seconds. 10. As if he was feeling for a pulse, as if he was saying goodbye to something or saying thank you, or both. Then he unstrapped, climbed down the ladder that the ground crew had positioned against the fuselage, and walked, did not run, did not stagger, to the edge of the runway, where he stood for a full minute, looking back at the aircraft, before turning to the approaching rescue officer and saying, in a voice that was perfectly level and entirely conversational, "Both engines failed after bird strike. We need the court of inquiry to look at the possibility of cross-engine debris damage, and someone should check the left engine nacelle." There was a fire. The extinguisher may not have activated. That was it. No drama, no visible emotion, no Hollywood moment of collapse or tears or trembling hands. Just a pilot reporting facts, doing his job, as if he hadn't just performed one of the most remarkable feats of airmanship in the history of Indian naval aviation. The investigation that followed was thorough, meticulous, and ultimately confirmed what Mara had suspected from the moment the first bang shook the airframe. The Indian Navy convened a court of inquiry within hours of the incident, assembling a team that included specialists from the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, engine experts from the Klimov Design Bureau in St. Petersburg, metallurgists from the Defense Metallurgical Research Laboratory in Hyderabad, and ornithologists from the Bombay Natural History Society. The black box data, recovered from the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, told a story that was both simple and devastating in its implications. At 12:07 hours and 14 seconds, approximately 15 seconds after Commander Mara engaged afterburner for the climb to 15,000 feet, the left engine ingested a flock of large birds. The birds were subsequently identified as Brahminy kites, Haliastur indus, a species of medium-sized raptor common along the Indian coastline, particularly in Goa, where the convergence of estuarine, coastal, and urban environments creates one of the densest raptor populations in South Asia. Individual Brahminy kites can weigh up to 600 grams and have a wingspan of over 100 centimeters. The flock, estimated at between 4 and 7 birds based on the damage pattern, entered the left engine intake in a concentrated cluster. At least 3 birds passed through the retractable protective grills and struck the first stage compressor blades at a combined closure speed of approximately 500 kilometers per hour. The kinetic energy of each impact was roughly equivalent to a 1 kilogram weight, dropped from a height of 100 meters. The effect on the compressor was catastrophic. Multiple blades on the first and second stages fractured at their roots. Fragments of titanium blade and organic material, bone, feather, tissue, were thrown backward through the engine at velocities exceeding 300 meters per second, destroying the combustion chamber liner, rupturing 2 fuel lines, and severing the left engine's primary oil supply line. Aviation fuel from the ruptured lines ignited on contact with the hot turbine components, and the left engine was consumed by fire in less than 2 seconds from the initial impact. But the story did not end there. And this was the finding that sent a chill through every MiG-29 squadron in the world. The Court of Inquiry determined that debris from the left engine, 3 fragments of compressor blade, the largest 8 centimeters long, exited through the engine casing, crossed the gap between nacelles, and struck the right engine's outer casing. 2 fragments penetrated the casing and damaged the high-pressure turbine, causing an unrecoverable surge. The entire sequence, from bird ingestion to total power loss, took less than 4 seconds. This finding revealed a fundamental vulnerability in the MiG-29's design. The proximity of the 2 engine nacelles, a feature that enhanced aerodynamic performance, meant that a catastrophic failure in one engine could destroy the other. It had been theoretically identified before. Now it had been proven in the worst possible way. The Court of Inquiry's final report ran to over 300 pages with 17 recommendations. But it also contained what amounted to the highest possible praise for Commander Mara. The relevant passage noted that the successful execution of a dead-stick landing following dual-engine failure represents an exceptional demonstration of airmanship, situational awareness, and decision-making under extreme duress. Commander Rajiv Mehra was awarded the now Sena Medal for Gallantry, one of the Indian Navy's highest peacetime decorations. The citation noted his exceptional presence of mind, outstanding professional competence, and selfless disregard for personal safety in choosing to attempt a dead-stick landing over a populated area rather than ejecting and allowing the aircraft to crash into civilian habitation. At the award ceremony, held at the Naval Headquarters in New Delhi 3 months later, Mehra stood at attention while the citation was read. When it was over, a reporter asked him what had gone through his mind in the moment he decided not to eject. His answer was characteristically brief. "I thought about the people below me," he said. That's all. Lieutenant Arjun Nair completed his carrier qualification on schedule, making his first solo arrested landing aboard INS Vikramaditya on a clear February morning in 2020, 3 months after the incident over Goa. He later told an interviewer from the Indian Defense Review that the experience had changed him as a pilot in a way he found difficult to articulate. "It didn't make me more afraid," he said, after a long pause. "It showed me what was possible when fear is acknowledged but not allowed to make the decisions." Petty Officer Suresh Kumar, the crew chief who had signed off KUB-09's maintenance log that morning, was cleared of any responsibility by the Court of Inquiry. The aircraft had been properly maintained. The engines had been functioning within specification. The bird strike was, in the clinical language of the report, an unforeseeable event. Kumar continued to serve with INS 303 until his retirement in 2022. At his farewell dinner, when asked about his most memorable day in the Navy, he did not hesitate. "The day Commander Mehra brought her home," he said. The aircraft itself, MiG-29, was repaired. Both engines were replaced. The airframe was inspected for structural damage. Hairline fractures were found in 2 fuselage frames and 3 wing spar joints, all repaired under the supervision of MiG engineers. And the aircraft was repainted in the Black Panther's distinctive color scheme. It flew again. It returned to the carrier. It continues to serve. But here is the thing about this story that stays with me. The detail that I keep coming back to. The thread that I pull on in the quiet hours. The question that I turn over in my mind like a stone in my pocket. Commander Mehra had 4 minutes and 13 seconds. That is how long the emergency lasted, from the first bang to the touchdown. 4 minutes and 13 seconds. 253 seconds. In that time, he processed a catastrophic dual engine failure. He evaluated his altitude, his airspeed, his position relative to the airfield and the terrain below. He calculated glide ratios in his head. He weighed the option of ejection against the risk to civilians on the ground. He attempted 2 engine restarts. He communicated with his backseater and with air traffic control. He flew a precision dead-stick approach to a runway that the math said he couldn't reach. He lowered the landing gear at exactly the right moment. He touched down on the center line. He caught the arresting wire. He stopped the aircraft. Every decision correct, every action precise, every judgment call validated by the outcome. All of it, in less time than it takes to listen to a single song on the radio. Some people will tell you that what Mehra did was instinct, that 15 years of training took over and his body knew what to do. There is truth in that. The muscle memory was there. The procedures were there. The thousands of hours had laid down neural pathways so deep that correct actions emerged almost automatically. But instinct does not explain the decision not to eject. That was not muscle memory. That was not a trained response. No simulator trains a pilot to weigh his own life against the lives of strangers on the ground. That was a moral choice, made in the furnace of the most extreme pressure a human being can experience by a man who understood what it meant to be responsible for something beyond himself. He could have pulled the handle. The book said he should. No one would have blamed him. His career would have continued. His reputation would have remained intact. But somewhere below him, between the coastline and the runway, in the schools and the markets and the apartment buildings of Vasco da Gama, people were living their lives. People who did not know his name. People who would never know his name. People who would go about their Saturday afternoon completely unaware that a man in a cockpit 8,000 feet above them had decided, in the space of a heartbeat, that their lives mattered more than his comfort, his safety, his survival. He chose to stay. He chose to fly. He chose to thread the narrowest of needles through the eye of the most unforgiving storm. And he did it. What happened over Goa on November 16th, 2019 was not a miracle. It was the product of years of training meeting a moment of crisis. Of a man who had spent his entire professional life getting ready for a moment he hoped would never come. And then, when it came, rising to meet it with everything he had. 4 minutes and 13 seconds. That is how long it took Commander Rajiv Mehra to prove something that every pilot knows, but that few are ever called upon to demonstrate, that the most powerful engine in any aircraft is not made of titanium and fuel nozzles and turbine blades. It is made of will, of discipline, of training so thorough and so relentless that it becomes a part of who you are rather than merely what you know. And above all, it is made of character, the kind of character that, in the worst moment of your life, makes you think not of yourself, but of the people who are counting on you, whether they know it or not. Both engines dead. 8,400 feet. Nothing but gravity and the wind and a pilot who refused to fall, and he brought it home. Now, Let me ask you something. If you were in that cockpit, strapped into a K-36DM ejection seat with the handle between your knees, with the engine silent and the ground rushing up and the math telling you that the runway was a mile beyond your reach, would you pull the handle or would you fly? I don't know what I would do. I'd like to think I know, but the truth is that nobody knows until they're in that seat, at that altitude, with that silence pressing in around them and the clock counting down to 0. But I know what Commander Mera did. And I know that because of what he did, children went home to their parents that evening. Fishermen pulled their boats onto the beach and went home to their wives. Students walked out of their classrooms and bought ice cream from the vendor on the corner. 100,000 people in Vasco da Gama had an ordinary, unremarkable Saturday afternoon. And not one of them knew that they owed that afternoon to a man in a flight suit who chose to stay in a burning, broken falling machine because he believed their lives were worth more than his fear. That is the story of Panther 09. 2 engines dead, 4 minutes and 13 seconds, and a pilot who refused to let go. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.